The cold Christmas light spilled across my daughter's dining table as she laughed and asked where the gifts were, like my presence as her father wasn't enough anymore. As I folded my hands to keep them steady, I felt the scrape of the chair beneath me while I chose silence over shame. While the clink of plates echoed around us, that sound grew heavier, marking every year she'd learned to measure love in money. The same hollow clatter followed my thoughts back to when she was little and only wanted me, not what I could buy. That's when I realized I hadn't lost her respect because I failed. I lost it because I kept paying to keep the peace. Still, I sat there knowing this Christmas would end differently, and my answer as her father would finally cost her more than it cost me. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Jack Harper sat in his car for a long moment after turning off the engine, his breath fogging the windshield as snow drifted lazily onto the curb. Emily's house glowed with warm yellow light, the kind meant to signal comfort and welcome. Laughter spilled faintly through the walls, muffled by glass and distance. Jack straightened his coat, rubbed his hands together, and told himself this was just another Christmas dinner, just another attempt. At 65, he had learned how to brace for disappointment, but that didn't stop it from finding him anyway. When he rang the doorbell, the door swung open almost immediately. Emily stood there, perfectly put together, her smile sharp rather than warm. Her eyes flicked past him, scanning his hands. "That's it," she said, eyebrows lifting. "No bags, no boxes." Jack swallowed. "Hi, Emily, Merry Christmas." She laughed lightly, the sound carrying into the house. "Wow, you really came empty-handed." Her tone wasn't surprised, it was amused, almost triumphant. She stepped aside just enough to let him in, already shaking her head as if confirming something she'd long suspected. Jack stepped over the threshold, the smell of roasted meat and cinnamon hitting him hard. The table was set beautifully, decorations pristine. Everyone else had brought something, wine bottles, wrapped gifts stacked neatly near the tree. Jack felt suddenly oversized, clumsy in his winter coat, like he'd missed a rule everyone else understood. He said nothing. Silence had become his armor over the years. He hung his coat carefully, ignoring the heat creeping up his neck. Emily watched him the way someone watches a slow-moving car accident, waiting for impact. "Guess times are really tough, huh?" she added casually, loud enough for the room to hear. "Must be hard not being able to provide anymore." The words landed deeper than she knew, or maybe exactly as deep as she intended. Jack took a seat at the edge of the table, hands folded in his lap. His eyes drifted to the tree, and for a moment the room blurred. He remembered a different Christmas, Emily at 7 years old, sitting cross-legged on the floor, more excited about the sound of tearing paper than what was inside. She'd thrown her arms around his neck back then, smelling like sugar cookies and pine, whispering thank you as if it was a secret meant only for him. Back when his presence mattered more than his wallet. Back when love hadn't come with conditions. "Dad," Emily said sharply, snapping him back. "You hearing me?" Jack met her gaze briefly, then looked away. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the old instinct to explain himself rising, how the business downturn wasn't laziness, how the money he once had hadn't disappeared out of selfishness. But he knew better now. Any word would be twisted, any defense turned into proof of failure. Emily scoffed. "Figures, silent as always when it counts." She leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You know, most fathers don't show up to Christmas dinner without gifts, especially when they've already cut their kids off." That one drew a few uncomfortable glances from the others. Jack felt them, but he didn't look up. His jaw tightened. He reminded himself why he was here, not to fight, not to justify, but because some part of him still hoped being present might count for something. Emily wasn't done. "It's embarrassing," she continued, her voice colder now. "I mean, everyone else made an effort, and you just show up." Jack's fingers curled slowly into his palms. He weighed his options carefully. If he spoke, the night would explode. If he stayed quiet, he'd swallow the insult whole. Neither choice felt like dignity. Then Emily smiled, a thin, deliberate smile, and raised her voice just enough to command the room. "Well," she said, gesturing toward the table, "if you didn't bring gifts, you don't eat." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Jack finally lifted his head. Every conversation stopped. Every eye turned toward him. His heart pounded, not with anger alone, but with something sharper, more dangerous. For the first time that night, he knew silence might no longer be enough. Jack stayed seated, his chair pulled slightly back from the table like he was already halfway gone. The clink of silverware and low chatter slowly returned around him, but it all sounded distant, muffled by the dull thud of his own thoughts. He stared at the grain of the wooden table, following a thin scratch that ran from one end to the other, and found himself thinking about numbers, bank balances, shrinking margins, the quiet panic that came with realizing the cushion he'd built over a lifetime was gone. He had never imagined this version of himself. The man who once paid tuition checks without blinking now calculated groceries. The father who'd solved problems with money now barely held himself together without it. What hurt most wasn't the loss itself, but how quickly Emily's respect had vanished with it. As if her love had been tied to a ledger all along. Emily leaned against the counter again, swirling wine in her glass. "You know," she said casually, "most people your age are enjoying retirement, traveling, spoiling their kids. Guess that didn't work out for you." A few people chuckled nervously. Jack didn't look up. She took his silence as permission. "I mean no gifts at Christmas," she shook her head. "It's kind of sad." Jack felt the words press against his chest, stacking one on top of the other. He told himself to breathe. He told himself this wasn't the place. That reacting would only give her what she wanted, proof that she still had the power to wound him. But the truth was harder to ignore. Somewhere along the way, his daughter had stopped seeing him as a father and started seeing him as a disappointment. He remembered Emily at 16, sitting at the kitchen table with college brochures spread everywhere, her eyes bright with possibility. She de-hugged him that night, tears in her eyes, telling him she didn't care where she went as long as he was proud of her. He'd worked late shifts back then, taken on extra contracts, skipped vacations without complaint. When he handed her the acceptance letter she wanted, she'd cried like he'd given her the world. Now, the world apparently came wrapped in paper with a price tag. Emily set her glass down harder than necessary. "You didn't even try," she said. "That's what gets me. You just showed up like your presence was enough." Jack finally lifted his eyes, meeting hers for a brief second. There was no warmth there, only expectation, judgment. He looked away again. His silence deepened, not because he lacked words, but because he had too many. Explanations about the business that collapsed, about the loans he'd quietly paid off for her, about the months he'd gone without telling anyone how bad things were getting. None of it mattered now. The past had been rewritten, reduced to what he could no longer give. Emily stepped closer to the table. "You know how this looks, right?" she said. "People are going to talk, they already do." Jack's hands rested flat on his thighs, fingers stiff. He wondered when he'd become someone she felt entitled to humiliate, when disappointment had turned into cruelty. Another flashback surfaced, Emily at 10 handing him a lopsided Christmas card she'd made at school. No money spent, just crayons and a crooked heart. He'd kept it in his desk drawer for years. Back then, effort had been enough. Love had been enough. Now, effort was measured in dollars. She sighed dramatically. "I guess I shouldn't be surprised. You've been pulling away for years. First the money, then the gifts, then," she shrugged. "What's left?" Jack felt something inside him settle. Not anger exactly, but a heavy, final kind of tiredness. He understood with painful clarity that engaging would only turn this into a spectacle. That defending himself would feed her resentment, not heal it. So he chose silence again. But this time, it wasn't surrender. It was defiance born of exhaustion, the quiet resistance of a man who no longer had the strength to fight every accusation. As the noise of the room swelled around him, Jack realized that staying silent was costing him something too. And he wasn't sure how much longer he could afford to pay that price. Dinner was served, but no one announced it. Plates were filled quietly, chairs scraped softly against the floor, and the table settled into an uneasy stillness that felt heavier than shouting ever could. Jack sat with his hands folded again, a full plate placed in front of him despite Emily's words earlier. He didn't touch it. The food steamed gently, the warmth rising toward his face, but he felt strangely cold. Emily sat across from him, her posture stiff, eyes fixed anywhere but on her father. She spoke easily to others at the table, laughing at small comments, passing dishes without looking his way. It was deliberate. Jack recognized it immediately, the silence used not as peace but as punishment. He studied her face when she wasn't watching. The sharpness he'd seen earlier hadn't faded, but beneath it was something else. Restlessness, irritation. His refusal to react had unsettled her more than any argument could have. Still, she wouldn't meet his eyes. Jack let his gaze drift down to his plate and felt the slow ache of memory creep in. He thought about how gradual the distance had been. No single moment where everything broke. Just missed calls, shorter conversations, the unspoken tension that followed every mention of money. He told himself it was temporary, that she'd understand eventually. Now he wondered if understanding had ever been the goal. Emily shifted in her chair, clearly uncomfortable with the quiet between them. She stabbed at her food, chewing harder than necessary. Jack could feel her frustration building like pressure behind a wall, but he stayed detached, almost numb. Somewhere along the way, detachment had become a survival skill. Sandra cleared her throat gently. "So," she said, forcing a small smile, "Jack, how's work been lately?" Jack looked up, surprised by the sound of his name. He hesitated before answering. "It's been fine," he said evenly. "Not good, not bad. Fine was safer." Emily's fork paused midair. Sandra nodded, trying to keep the conversation afloat. "That's good. It's been a tough year for everyone." Jack could hear the effort in her voice, the careful neutrality. She glanced between them, hopeful, as if one normal exchange might bridge the gap. But Emily said nothing. She took another bite, eyes still down, jaw tight. The silence stretched again. Jack's thoughts drifted backward, pulled there by the clink of cutlery and the soft glow of Christmas lights reflected in the window. He remembered a year when Emily had insisted they eat in the living room, balancing plates on their laps so they could watch old holiday movies together. She'd fallen asleep against his shoulder before dessert, trusting, unguarded. He'd stayed still for hours just so he wouldn't wake her. That version of her felt impossibly far away. Across the table, Emily pushed her plate aside. She folded her arms, gaze fixed on the wall behind Jack. It was a clear message. Whatever connection they once had was not up for discussion tonight. Not on her terms. Sandra tried again, softer this time. "Emily, did you ever tell your dad about?" "I'm not hungry," Emily cut in abruptly, standing up. Her chair scraped loudly, the sound slicing through the room. She didn't look at Jack as she gathered her napkin and set it down with unnecessary precision. "I'm going to lie down." No one stopped her. Jack watched as she walked away, every step firm, controlled. The hallway swallowed her up, and with it, any remaining illusion that this dinner could be salvaged. The room felt emptier without her, quieter in a way that pressed in on him. Sandra exhaled slowly, rubbing her temples. "She's stressed," she said, though it sounded more like a question than a defense. Jack nodded once. He didn't trust himself to say more. As he sat there, untouched food growing cold in front of him, Jack wondered when silence had become their default language, when distance had replaced conversation. He cut her off emotionally to protect himself, or so he'd told himself. Now, watching the doorway where Emily had disappeared, he wasn't sure anymore if that choice had saved him, or cost him something he might never get back. Jack's phone vibrated against the kitchen counter late the next morning, the sound sharp in the quiet house. He had barely slept. The silence after Christmas dinner lingered like a bruise, tender and unavoidable. When he glanced at the screen and saw Paul Dawson's name, his stomach tightened before he even answered. "Jack," Paul said without preamble, his voice measured in that familiar legal way. "I wanted to give you a heads up before you heard it elsewhere. Emily filed for financial assistance this morning." Jack closed his eyes. "Assistance," he repeated, as if the word itself might change shape if he said it slowly enough. "Yes, a formal request, citing hardship. She's claiming she's been cut off without warning." Jack leaned against the counter, the cool surface grounding him. Anger flared first, hot and immediate, followed closely by something heavier. Guilt, duty, the old reflex to fix what was breaking, even when it broke him in the process. "I haven't responded yet," Paul continued, "but you need to decide how you want to proceed." After the call ended, Jack stood there longer than necessary, staring at the darkened window. He thought of Emily's face at the dinner table, the certainty in her voice, the way she'd spoken as if his support was owed, not given. By noon his phone buzzed again. This time it was Paul. A friend had sent him a screenshot. Emily's social media post was public, unapologetic. When your own father turns his back on you right before Christmas, you learn who really cares. Beneath it, a flood of comments, sympathy, outrage, quiet judgment aimed squarely at him. Jack felt something shift. This wasn't private anymore. It wasn't just between them. Sandra found him sitting at the dining table later that afternoon, phone face down, hands clasped tightly. She didn't need to ask what was wrong. "She's desperate," Sandra said gently after he explained. "You know she wouldn't do this if she had another option." Jack looked up at her. "She humiliated me," he said quietly, "in front of everyone, and now she's doing it again, publicly." Sandra sighed, rubbing her arms as if cold. "She's your daughter. You can't just let her drown because you're hurt." That stung more than he expected. He spent the rest of the day drifting through memories he hadn't invited. Tuition payments wired without discussion. Rent covered when she came up short. Credit card balances quietly erased. Every time she'd fallen, he'd been heir with a financial net, convincing himself it was temporary, that she'd grow out of needing him. Instead, she'd grown to expect it. By evening, Jack sat across from Tom Sanders in a quiet cafe, steam rising from untouched coffee cups between them. Tom listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. "You've spent years trying to buy peace," Tom said finally, "and it hasn't worked." Jack frowned, "So I just walk away." "No," Tom said carefully. "You stop rescuing her. There's a difference. Right now she doesn't feel consequences. She feels entitled." Jack stared at the table. "She's filing paperwork against me, dragging my name through the mud." "And if you cave now," Tom replied, "you teach her that pressure works. That humiliation is a strategy." The words settled heavily. Jack realized something then, subtle but unmistakable. The balance of power had already shifted, not because he'd lost money, but because Emily had decided to force his hand. When Jack got home, he reread Paul's message outlining his options. He thought of the man he used to be, the father who believed providing meant protecting at all costs. And he thought of the man sitting alone in his kitchen now, exhausted, bruised, but still standing. He typed a brief reply to Paul, "I'm not approving the request." His finger hovered before sending. Doubt crept in, whispering about regret, about what kind of father says no when his child asks for help. Then he thought of Emily's post, the dinner table, the years of quiet enabling. Jack pressed send. For the first time in a long while, the decision felt heavy, but clear. The letter arrived 2 days later, slipped through Jack's mail slot in a plain white envelope with no return address. He almost tossed it aside with the rest of the junk mail, but something about its weight made him pause. He opened it standing at the kitchen counter, glasses perched low on his nose. By the second paragraph, his hands had gone numb. The language was formal, cold, and unmistakably threatening. Emily's name was typed in bold, followed by a balance so large Jack had to read it twice to be sure he hadn't miscounted the zeros. The sender identified themselves as a creditor, outlining missed payments, breached agreements, and imminent legal action. At the bottom, his own name appeared, not as a courtesy, but as a potential point of contact. Jack lowered himself into a chair. He'd known Emily was struggling. That much had been obvious, but this was something else entirely. This wasn't late bills or bad budgeting. This was collapse. As he read further, the picture grew darker. Multiple creditors, short-term loans stacked on top of one another, investments that didn't align with any business plan he could recognize. There were references to shell accounts, to funds moved and never returned. Words like misrepresentation and fraud appeared more than once. Jack felt a wave of heat rush through him, anger first, sharp and accusing. Then guilt, slow and suffocating. How had he missed this? Or worse, had he ignored it because he didn't want to see it? He thought back to the moment he'd cut off financial support, telling himself it was necessary, that she needed to learn. But sitting there now, holding evidence of just how deep she'd gone, that conviction wavered. If he'd stepped in sooner, could this have been avoided? Or had his constant rescuing pushed her toward even bigger risks? His phone rang before he could settle on an answer. Jack Harper, the woman on the other end asked. Her voice was steady, professional. Yes. This is Detective Linda Hartley. I'm calling in relation to your daughter, Emily Harper. Jack's throat tightened. What about her? We're reviewing some of her recent financial activity, Hartley said carefully. At this stage, I want to be clear. She hasn't been charged with anything, but there are irregularities, transactions that suggest possible criminal involvement. Jack closed his eyes, pressing 2 fingers to his temple. Am I in trouble? He asked. That depends, Hartley replied. Were you involved in any of her business dealings? Did you provide funding, knowingly or otherwise? No, Jack said quickly. I haven't given her money in months. There was a brief pause. That may be relevant, Hartley said, but given your relationship, we may need to speak in person. When the call ended, the kitchen felt unbearably quiet. The letter lay open on the table, its contents burning into his vision. Anger surged again, this time mixed with fear. Emily hadn't just been reckless, she'd been dangerous, to herself, to him. Sandra found him there later, staring at nothing. He handed her the letter without a word. She read it slowly, her face draining of color. Oh, Jack, she whispered, this is bad. She's in over her head, he said, way over. Sandra sat beside him, gripping the paper. If this goes the way it looks like it might, she could ruin her life. And yours. Jack nodded. He felt the familiar tug of responsibility tightening around his chest. No matter how angry he was, no matter how betrayed he felt, she was still his daughter. The instinct to step in, to absorb the damage, was almost automatic. But another thought followed close behind. If he intervened now, what lesson would she learn? He stood up, pacing slowly. Every step felt like a calculation. Help her, and risk becoming complicit in whatever mess she'd made. Walk away and watch her face consequences that could follow her forever. That night, as he lay awake staring at the ceiling, Jack understood the truth he'd been avoiding. This decision wouldn't just define Emily's future. It would define who he was willing to be as her father. Jack didn't go to Emily's apartment right away. He sat in his car for several minutes after pulling into the cracked, uneven lot, watching a flickering porch light buzz above her door. The place was smaller than he'd expected, older, the kind of building that spoke of compromises made quietly. When he finally stepped out, It wasn't because his anger had faded, but because his sense of responsibility hadn't. Emily opened the door slowly. She looked tired in a way Jack hadn't seen before. Not dramatic, not defiant, just worn down. The sharp edge she'd carried for so long seemed dulled, replaced by something fragile. "I talked to a lawyer," Jack said once they were inside. "He didn't sit. About your situation." Her shoulders tensed, and "I'm willing to help, with the legal part," he clarified. "Nothing else, not yet." For a moment she just stared at him, as if she hadn't expected that answer at all. Then she exhaled, a long, shaky breath she'd been holding in. They sat at a small table pushed against the wall. Silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, less hostile, more uncertain. "I never meant for it to get this bad," Emily said finally, staring at her hands. "Every time I thought I could fix it, it just spiraled." Jack listened, truly listened. She talked about watching him build a successful life, about growing up in the shadow of his achievements, how every failure of hers felt louder by comparison, how asking for money had started as necessity and turned into expectation without her noticing the shift. "I felt like I could never measure up," she admitted quietly, "no matter what I did." The words hit him harder than any insult she'd thrown. Jack felt something loosen in his chest, not forgiveness, but understanding. He thought about his own father, a man who believed silence was strength and praise was weakness. He'd grown up learning that providing was the same as caring, that emotions were indulgences. Somewhere along the way, he'd passed that lesson on without realizing it. Sandra was right there with him when he mentioned it later that evening. "She doesn't just need money, Jack," she said gently. "She needs to know you see her." Jack nodded, staring out the window. He had spent years thinking distance kept everyone safe. Now he wondered who it had really protected. When he returned to Emily's apartment the next day, she seemed different, less defensive. She met his eyes when she spoke. "I'm sorry," she said, and this time the words didn't come with conditions. "For how I treated you, for what I said. I was angry and scared." It wasn't a grand apology. No tears, no speeches, but it was real. Jack felt it in the way she didn't look away afterward. "I don't know how to fix everything," she added, "but I don't want to keep hurting you." Jack leaned back in his chair, the weight of the moment settling over him. Part of him wanted to reach for his old solution, to smooth things over with money, to erase the problem instead of sitting with it. The other part, the tired but wiser part, hesitated. He had agreed to help her legally. That alone felt like a risk. But watching her now, stripped of bravado, finally honest, he wondered if cutting her off completely had been too blunt an instrument. As he stood to leave, Emily asked quietly, "Do you think we can start over?" Jack didn't answer right away. He stepped into the hallway, the door closing softly behind him, and let the question linger. For the first time since Christmas, he wasn't sure whether holding the line meant strength or fear of trying again. Emily lost her job on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind of day that already felt like defeat before it began. Jack heard about it from Sandra first, her voice tight with worry as she explained that Emily's company had restructured, a word that softened the blow without changing the outcome. By the end of the week, Emily was packing boxes, trading her apartment for something smaller, cheaper, and far less forgiving. Jack tried to tell himself it wasn't his responsibility anymore. He had drawn boundaries. He had done what everyone told him he should do. And yet, when Sandra asked him to check on her, he didn't hesitate for long. "She's hitting bottom," Sandra said. "If you don't show her some calm, passion now, she might never forgive you." Jack felt the familiar conflict tighten in his chest. Compassion had always come at a cost. He had paid it for years, often without complaint, until it started to feel like betrayal rather than love. Emily's new apartment sat above a closed-down storefront, its windows fogged and dim. The hallway smelled faintly of dust and old paint. When she opened the door, Jack saw the truth immediately. The place was cramped, sparsely furnished, boxes stacked against the walls like evidence of a life shrinking in on itself. "You didn't have to come," Emily said, though there was no conviction in her voice. Jack stepped inside anyway. He took in the thin mattress on the floor, the single chair pulled up to a folding table. This wasn't hardship performed for sympathy. This was real. They sat across from each other, knees almost touching. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Emily's composure cracked. "I messed everything up," she said, her voice breaking. Tears followed, unrestrained. "I was so angry at you, at everything. I didn't see how bad it was getting until it was too late." Jack listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer reassurance. He had learned that words given too quickly often robbed moments of their truth. "I'm sorry," she continued, wiping her face with the sleeve of her sweater, "for the things I said, for treating you like you were nothing but a wallet." The apology landed, but it didn't erase what came before it. Jack felt the weight of her resentment still there, lingering beneath the tears. He wondered how much of her regret was about losing him, and how much was about losing the safety he represented. Sandra's words echoed in his mind, urging softness. But another memory pushed back just as hard. Emily's public accusations, the entitlement, the way she'd turned pain into leverage. He stood, pacing the small room, the ceiling seeming lower with every step. This was the crossroads he'd been avoiding. Step in fully and risk repeating the same cycle. Step back and risk becoming the father who abandoned his child when she needed him most. Emily looked up at him, eyes red. "I don't expect you to fix this," she said quietly. I don't want to lose you." Jack stopped in front of her. He took a breath, steadying himself. "I'm not going anywhere," he said at last. "I'll always be here for you." Relief flickered across her face, but he wasn't finished. "But you need to learn to stand on your own," he continued, his voice firm but controlled. "I can't keep saving you from the consequences of your choices. That's not helping you, and it's destroying us." Emily nodded slowly, tears still falling. She didn't argue. That, more than anything, told him how close she was to breaking. As Jack left the apartment, he paused in the hallway, listening to the faint sounds of the city outside. He had chosen his words carefully, drawing a line he wasn't sure he could hold. Because as much as he wanted to believe this was the moment everything changed, a part of him feared it was only the beginning of something even harder to face. The weeks that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm that felt worse than open conflict. Jack and Emily spoke more often now, but every conversation carried an invisible weight. Words were chosen carefully, pauses stretched too long, and nothing ever landed quite where it was meant to. They were no longer fighting, but they weren't healing either. Jack felt it most in his chest, a constant heaviness that never fully lifted. He woke up tired, went to bed tired, and carried the sense that every interaction with his daughter required effort he was running out of. He had done what he believed was right, set boundaries, drawn lines, but standing on them left him isolated, watching from a distance as his family struggled to find solid ground. Sandra tried to hold the middle. She called Emily regularly, checked in on Jack daily, and relayed messages between them like a careful diplomat. "She's trying," she'd tell Jack. "She just doesn't know how to show it yet." To Emily, she'd say, "Your father cares more than he lets on." But reassurance lost its power when nothing visibly changed. Emily felt that lack of change acutely. Every step she took forward seemed to be met with quiet scrutiny instead of trust. Jack listened when she spoke, but his eyes stayed guarded. He offered advice, not comfort, presence, not warmth. To Emily, it felt like being tolerated rather than welcomed back. "I'm doing everything you asked," she snapped during one phone call. "What else do you want from me?" Jack didn't have an answer that wouldn't reopen old wounds. "Just time," he said, knowing how hollow it sounded. Time stretched, the space between them hardened. Jack noticed his own walls rising higher. It wasn't intentional. It was exhaustion. Every apology he heard felt provisional. Every improvement felt temporary. He found himself bracing for the next disappointment instead of hoping for change. The emotional distance he'd once chosen now felt permanent, as if his heart had learned to lock itself automatically. Emily felt that withdrawal keenly. She stopped calling as often. When she did, her voice carried an edge again, resentment creeping back in where vulnerability had briefly lived. Sandra's attempts to intervene only deepened the frustration. "It feels like I'm the only one trying," Emily told her mother one evening. "Dad's already decided who I am." Sandra had no response that didn't sound like an excuse. Alone, Emily began searching for validation wherever she could find it. Friends who sympathized. Online spaces that reinforced her sense of being wronged. The narrative shifted subtly, from responsibility to victimhood. The more she leaned into it, the more resentful she became, convinced that no matter what she did, it would never be enough. Jack saw the signs even before Sandra mentioned them. The tone of Emily's messages changed. The distance grew colder. He felt a familiar, sinking realization take shape. Cutting off her allowance had stopped the financial bleeding. It had drawn a clear boundary, but it hadn't repaired what was broken between them. If anything, it had exposed how deep the damage really was. One evening, Jack sat alone in the living room, the house quiet except for the ticking of a clock he'd owned for decades. He thought about all the things he'd done to protect himself, and all the things he'd hoped those actions would fix. They hadn't. He understood then that this wasn't about money anymore. It never really had been. It was about trust, pride, and years of unspoken resentment on both sides. And as he stared at his phone, unread messages waiting, Jack realized with a sinking certainty that the war between him and his daughter hadn't ended. It had only gone cold. Jack had heard Emily apologize before. The words had come in different forms over the years, quick, defensive, sometimes sincere, sometimes offered only after consequences had already landed. Each apology had chipped away at his resolve in the moment, only to leave him feeling foolish later when nothing truly changed. Now, sitting alone in his study, he replayed them all, stacked together like a history of almosts. What lingered wasn't just what she'd done, but what she'd never acknowledged. The nights he'd lain awake worrying. The quiet humiliation of being treated like an inconvenience. The way his presence had been tolerated only as long as it came with financial backing. Those wounds didn't disappear just because the word sorry was spoken more carefully this time. When Emily asked to meet, Jack nearly said no. It felt safer to keep distance, to let time dull the edges rather than risk reopening them. But Sandra watched him from across the kitchen table, reading the hesitation on his face. "If you don't give her away back," she said gently, "you might lose her anyway." They met at a small cafe halfway between their homes, neutral ground. Emily arrived first, hands wrapped around a mug she didn't drink from. When Jack sat down, she looked up at him, eyes steady but tired. "I know I don't deserve another chance," she said quietly, "but I need you to hear this." Jack said nothing, his expression unreadable. "I took everything you did for me for granted," Emily continued. "Not just the money, the time, the patience. I acted like it would always be there, no matter how I treated you." Her voice wavered, but she didn't stop. "I see now how much that hurt you, and I'm sorry for it, truly." Jack felt the words land, heavy but incomplete. He wanted to accept them, to let this be the moment where things finally turned. But another part of him resisted, aching with unspoken resentment. "You apologized for the money," he said slowly, "but you never apologized for how you made me feel." Emily blinked, caught off guard. "I felt invisible," Jack continued. "Like I only mattered when I could give you something. That doesn't just go away." The silence between them thickened. Old wounds surfaced easily, too easily. Emily shifted in her seat, shame flickering across her face. "I didn't know how to say it," she admitted. "I didn't think you needed that from me." That answer hurt more than anger ever had. Sandra's voice echoed in Jack's mind later that night, reminding him of what was at stake. Holding on to anger doesn't protect you forever, she'd said. Sometimes it just keeps you alone. Jack lay awake, staring at the ceiling, weighing the cost of his resentment. He had every right to be angry. No one could take that from him. But he couldn't ignore the growing realization that keeping Emily at arm's length was costing him more than it was costing her. They met again a week later, this time walking through a quiet park. The conversation was awkward, cautious, stripped of grand gestures. They talked about therapy, about work prospects, about the weather, anything but the past, until the past inevitably crept back in. "I'm trying," Emily said at one point. "I know it won't fix everything, I just don't want to give up." Jack stopped walking. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw both the daughter he remembered and the woman she had become. "I can't promise forgiveness overnight," he said, "and I can't pretend nothing happened." Emily nodded, bracing herself. "But I'll give you another chance," Jack continued. "Not because everything's okay, but because I don't want this to be how we end." Relief crossed her face, cautious and restrained. No celebration, no certainty. As they walked on, Jack understood the truth of his decision. Forgiveness, if it came, would be slow and fragile, and this chance he'd given her wasn't a resolution. It was a risk. Jack thought he understood the scope of Emily's problems. He had seen the letters, spoken to the detective, listened to half-confessions wrapped in apologies. But understanding, he realized, had limits, and Emily's financial mess had crossed them. Each new detail arrived heavier than the last, piling up until the situation no longer felt like a crisis, but a slow-moving collapse. Detective Linda Hartley called again on a Friday afternoon. Jack took the call in his car, parked outside his own office, the engine still running. "We've connected several transactions," Hartley said, her tone more direct this time. "Your daughter appears to be part of a larger financial scheme, not the mastermind, but not incidental either." Jack tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "What does that mean?" "It means charges are possible," Hartley replied. "Fraud, misrepresentation, at minimum civil exposure, at worst criminal." The word hung there, heavy and undeniable. When Jack confronted Emily later that evening, the conversation unraveled faster than he expected. She paced her apartment, agitation replacing the remorse she'd shown weeks earlier. "I didn't force anyone," she said defensively. "People knew the risks." "You signed documents," Jack shot back. "You moved money that wasn't yours." "I was trying to fix things," Emily snapped. "You don't understand how much pressure I was under." Jack felt something fracture inside him. Pressure doesn't erase responsibility. Emily stopped pacing, eyes flashing. "You're acting like this is all my fault." Jack stared at her, stunned. That refusal to fully own what she'd done cut deeper than the damage itself. He had been prepared to fight banks, lawyers, even courts. He wasn't prepared to fight denial. Sandra called later, her voice tight with urgency. "She's scared, Jack. You can't abandon her now. She's going to need legal support, real support." "I've been supporting her," Jack said quietly, "even now." "But this is bigger than feelings," Sandra insisted. "This is her future." Jack ended the call without agreeing, his chest burning with a familiar mix of betrayal and exhaustion. Emily hadn't just made reckless choices. She had dragged his name into it, his credibility, his standing. If this went public, people wouldn't see nuance. They'd see a father who either funded fraud or failed to stop it. That night, Jack spread documents across his dining table. Account summaries, property deeds, trust paperwork he hadn't reviewed in years. He called his attorney, then his accountant. Each conversation was clinical, necessary, and quietly devastating. "We need to protect your assets," Paul Dawson told him. "Worst-case scenario, they could try to pierce family ties. Even if nothing sticks, it can get ugly." Jack nodded, though no one could see him. protect the family name. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was bracing for war against consequences his own child had unleashed. The financial strain began to show in subtler ways too: sleepless nights, short tempers, a constant buzzing tension that never shut off. Jack snapped at small inconveniences, then retreated into silence, ashamed of his own volatility. He felt older than his years, worn down by problems money couldn't simply solve. Emily called twice the next day. He didn't answer. It wasn't punishment, it was self-preservation. By Sunday evening, Jack sat alone again, staring at a legal pad filled with contingencies and timelines. He felt helpless in a way he hadn't since he was a young man with more responsibilities than resources. Anger simmered beneath the surface, but beneath that was grief, for the daughter he thought he knew, for the life that was unraveling despite his best efforts. He would prepare, he would protect what he could, he would not be blindsided. But as Jack closed the folder and turned off the light, one thought refused to leave him alone. If Emily didn't take responsibility soon, no amount of preparation would be enough to save either of them. Emily called late at night, her voice already breaking before Jack could say hello. The bravado she'd worn for years was gone, stripped away by fear and exhaustion. Words spilled out in a rush, lawyers demanding retainers, deadlines she didn't understand, numbers that kept growing no matter how hard she tried to contain them. "I can't do this alone," she said finally. "I don't have the money, Dad. I don't know what to do." Jack closed his eyes, the phone pressed tightly to his ear. He heard desperation there, real this time. But layered beneath it were echoes he couldn't ignore: her mockery at Christmas, the public accusations, the entitlement that had poisoned their relationship long before the money disappeared. "I need time," he said quietly, though even that felt like a betrayal of his own resolve. Sandra didn't give him much of it. She found him the next morning sitting at the kitchen table, untouched coffee growing cold. "She's scared," Sandra said softly. "Not angry, not manipulative, scared." Jack didn't look up. "She was scared before," he replied, "and it didn't stop her from burning everything down." "That doesn't mean you let her fall now." Sandra said, "She doesn't need a lesson, she needs her father." Those words stayed with him longer than he wanted them to. Later that afternoon, Jack met with Paul Dawson in his office, the walls lined with framed degrees and quiet authority. Paul didn't soften the reality. "Legal fees are going to escalate," he said. "If charges are filed, she'll need serious representation, and if you step in financially, it has to be structured carefully. No blank checks, no informal help." Jack nodded slowly. "And if I do?" Paul leaned back. "Then she'll face this with limited resources. Outcomes won't be kind." The drive home felt longer than usual. Jack thought about every time he'd stepped in before, telling himself it was the last time. He thought about the line he'd drawn and how close he was to erasing it. That night he and Sandra talked for hours, not arguments, confessions. "I'm afraid," Jack admitted, "not just of what she's done, but of what helping her again will do to me." Sandra reached for his hand. "Mercy doesn't have to mean surrender," she said. "You can help without losing yourself." Jack slept poorly. When morning came, his decision still felt heavy, but it had taken shape. He met Emily at Paul's office 2 days later. She looked smaller there, shoulders hunched, eyes ringed with exhaustion. She didn't speak at first, waiting. "I'll help," Jack said finally, "with the legal bills." Relief washed over her face, but Jack raised a hand before she could speak. "There are conditions," he continued. "Strict ones, full transparency, therapy, no excuses, and you take responsibility publicly and privately for what you've done." Emily nodded quickly, tears spilling over. "I will, I swear." Jack watched her carefully. "This isn't a rescue," he said. "It's a chance, one chance." She wiped her face, her voice barely audible. "Thank you." As they left the office, Jack felt no relief, only the familiar weight of risk settling onto his shoulders again. He had chosen to step back into the fire, not out of weakness, but because walking away would have hardened him into someone he didn't want to become. Still, as he watched Emily walk ahead of him down the sidewalk, Jack couldn't shake the fear that mercy, once again, might cost him more than he was prepared to lose. And this time, there might be no way back. With Jack's help, the free fall stopped, but it didn't reverse. That much became clear quickly. The money covered legal retainers and stabilized the immediate crisis, but it did nothing to erase the damage Emily had already done to her life. Rebuilding wasn't dramatic. It was slow, uncomfortable, and humbling in ways she had never experienced before. Emily started therapy at Jack's insistence. At first, she spoke about it clinically, as if describing an obligation rather than a lifeline. Weekly sessions, hard questions, long silences that left her drained. Jack listened without commentary, noting what she didn't say as much as what she did. He watched for signs of performance, for rehearsed remorse, unwilling to mistake effort for change. Trust, once broken, didn't return easily. Sandra, on the other hand, allowed herself to feel relief. The constant tension that had gripped her for months loosened slightly. She slept better. She smiled more. But Jack noticed the strain that crept into their conversations. How often money came up. How carefully Sandra phrased her concerns, as if afraid to trigger another fracture. "This can't go on forever," she said one night, not accusing, just tired. Jack nodded. He felt it too. Helping Emily had reopened old wounds in their marriage, reminding both of them how much had been buried instead of resolved. He wondered whether supporting his daughter meant sacrificing pieces of his own stability yet again. Megan noticed before either of them said it out loud. She called Jack one afternoon, her voice steady in a way that surprised him. "I know you're scared this is going to repeat itself," she said, "but she is trying. You don't have to forget the past to acknowledge that." Jack didn't answer right away. He wasn't used to being reminded to see the good. Emily's progress came in fragments. She took responsibility for small things, showing up on time, following through on commitments, admitting when she was overwhelmed instead of lashing out. She spoke differently now, less certain, more open. Once, she laughed at something Jack said, and for a split second he heard the girl she used to be. It unsettled him more than it comforted him. Because glimpses weren't guarantees. Jack struggled privately. Supporting Emily meant revisiting memories he had spent years trying to bury. His own childhood. The emotional distance he'd learned to call strength. He began to understand that part of what he'd been reacting to in Emily was himself. His own failures mirrored back at him in ways he hadn't been ready to face. Some nights he sat alone in his study long after the house had gone quiet, wondering whether helping her was healing either of them, or just delaying an inevitable reckoning. Emily came by one evening unannounced, a folder tucked under her arm, therapy notes, budget plans, lists of goals written in uneven handwriting. "I wanted you to see this," she said, laying it out carefully. "I'm not asking for anything, I just wanted you to know I'm trying." Jack looked at the papers for a long time. They weren't impressive, they weren't foolproof, but they were honest. He nodded once. "I see it." It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't trust, but it was acknowledgement. As Emily left, Jack felt something stir, cautious hope, edged with fear. He could see the outline of the daughter he once knew, faint but real. Still, as he closed the door behind her, one thought stayed with him. If this rebuilding failed, it wouldn't just break Emily. It would break whatever strength he had left to give. For a while, it seemed like the worst was behind them. Emily kept her appointments, sent out resumes, spoke with the careful humility of someone who knew how close she'd come to losing everything. Jack allowed himself to breathe again, not deeply, but enough to function. Then the cracks returned. It started small. Missed therapy sessions explained away as scheduling issues. Job interviews postponed, then quietly abandoned. Jack noticed the pattern immediately. He always did. Experience had taught him that regression rarely announced itself. It slipped in wearing excuses. He tried not to confront her right away. He told himself progress wasn't linear, but doubt crept in all the same. Had he mistaken effort for performance again? Had helping her only delayed the reckoning he'd feared from the beginning? Sandra noticed the shift in him before he said anything. "You're pulling back," she told him one evening. "Every time she stumbles, you shut down." Jack didn't deny it, "Because I've seen this before." "That doesn't mean you stop believing," Sandra said, frustration edging into her voice. "Family means second chances, Jack, not endless punishment." Her words landed hard. He wanted to argue, to explain that what looked like punishment to her felt like self-preservation to him. But the truth was messier. He was tired of being hurt in the same ways by the same patterns. Megan called him the next day, cutting through the noise with quiet clarity. "You can't help her move forward if you're still fighting the past," she said. "I know you're protecting yourself, but you're also holding her hostage to mistakes she's already paying for." Jack sat with that longer than he expected. Megan wasn't asking him to forget. She was asking him to release control he'd been gripping too tightly. Still, the fear didn't disappear. Detective Hartley called again later that week, her voice calm but unyielding. "The investigation is ongoing," she said. "There's a strong possibility your daughter will face consequences, civil at the very least, potentially more." Jack felt the old tension snap back into place. Every improvement Emily made felt suddenly fragile, provisional, progress under threat. When he told Emily about the call, she went quiet, too quiet. Her eyes dropped, her shoulders stiffened. Jack saw something in her expression that unsettled him, not defiance but avoidance. "You knew this could happen," he said carefully. "I know," she replied, but there was a distance in her voice that made his stomach tighten. That night Jack lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His internal battle raged without resolution. Protect himself and risk becoming emotionally unreachable. Stay fully present and risk being pulled under by consequences he didn't create. He thought about trust, not as a gift but as a burden, something that demanded vulnerability without guarantees. In the morning, Emily texted him asking if they could talk later, just the two of them. No explanations, no context. Jack stared at the message for a long time before replying. Because whatever choice he made next, standing beside her or stepping back, would shape not only her future, but the fragile peace he'd fought so hard to maintain. And he wasn't sure which one he could afford to lose. The lie surfaced quietly the way most damaging truths do. Jack discovered it by accident, an email forwarded to him by mistake, a scheduling notice from a therapist Emily had claimed she was still seeing weekly. The date didn't match. Neither did the tone. When he checked further, the pattern revealed itself with brutal clarity. Missed sessions, half-truths, progress exaggerated just enough to sound convincing. Jack felt something sink in his chest, not shock, recognition. When he confronted Emily, she didn't deny it at first. She stalled, deflected. And then, when the silence became unbearable, she admitted it with a shrug that cut deeper than any raised voice. "I didn't think it mattered that much," she said. "I was trying." "That's not trying," Jack replied, his voice tight. "That's lying." The room med to close in around them. Emily's defensiveness flared immediately. "You were never going to trust me anyway," she snapped. "So why does it matter?" "Because I wanted to," Jack thought but didn't say. Instead, he withdrew. The warmth he'd cautiously begun to offer vanished, replaced by distance so complete it startled even him. He answered messages curtly. He stopped asking questions. The wall he'd built years ago rose back into place, reinforced by fresh disappointment. Sandra couldn't stay silent anymore. "You're punishing her," she said one evening, frustration spilling over. "And you're punishing yourself." "I'm protecting myself," Jack shot back. "There's a difference." Sandra shook her head. I'm tired of standing in the middle. I'm tired of choosing words carefully so neither of you explodes. Megan tried next, sitting with Jack in his study, her voice calm but insistent. She messed up, she said. But if every mistake resets her back to zero with you, she'll never catch up. Jack stared at the bookshelf, his jaw clenched. And if I keep forgiving, I teach her that lying has no cost. Neither answer felt right. Emily felt the shift immediately. The absence of even cautious support left her unmoored. Her frustration curdled into anger and anger into recklessness. Old habits resurfaced. Late nights, questionable company, impulsive decisions she justified as freedom. When Jack found out, the confrontation was inevitable. "This is what happens when you stop pretending," Emily shouted. "You don't actually care if I get better. You just want control." Jack's voice was low, steady, and lethal. "I cared enough to keep showing up. You couldn't even be honest." The argument burned hot and fast, every old wound dragged back into the light. Accusations, regrets, the kind of truths people save for when they want to hurt. By the time it ended, nothing felt repairable. In the days that followed, the house felt different, quieter, heavier. Sandra moved through it like a ghost, caught between loyalty and exhaustion. Megan stopped offering advice and started offering space. Jack began to question himself in the silence. Had he been too rigid? Had his fear of being hurt again turned him into someone incapable of grace? The doubt gnawed at him, even as pride kept him still. The family felt split along invisible lines, each conversation a negotiation, each gathering an exercise in restraint. No one knew how to move forward without reopening wounds that refused to close. And as Jack sat alone one night, staring at his phone with Emily's name glowing unanswered on the screen, he realized the divide between them wasn't just emotional anymore. It was becoming permanent. The truth no longer arrived in pieces. It arrived all at once, heavy and undeniable. Emily's lies weren't isolated missteps anymore. They were a pattern, woven so tightly into her daily life that Jack couldn't tell where fear ended and manipulation began. Every promise she'd made, every assurance of progress now felt suspect. Trust, once strained, finally collapsed under its own weight. Jack asked her to meet him at his house. Neutral ground again, but this time there was no pretense of reconciliation. Emily sensed it the moment she walked in. The air was too still. Jack didn't offer coffee. He didn't sit. "I know," he said before she could speak. "About the job applications, about therapy, about the money you said you hadn't touched." Emily froze. "This isn't confusion," Jack continued, his voice controlled but stripped of warmth. "It's dishonesty, repeated, deliberate." Her defenses rose instinctively. "I was trying to hold things together." "No," Jack snapped, the word cutting through the room. "You were trying to avoid consequences." The anger he'd buried for months finally surfaced, sharp and raw. He spoke about the humiliation, the fear of legal fallout, the exhaustion of constantly bracing for the next revelation. He didn't raise his voice, but every word landed with force. "I have stood by you while you tore things apart," he said. "And every time I believed you, you gave me another reason not to." Emily's composure shattered. She sank into a chair, face in her hands, sobs breaking through despite her efforts to contain them. "I can't do this," she cried. "I never could. I was always failing. No matter how hard I tried, it was never enough, not compared to you." Jack felt the anger waver, replaced by something heavier. Pain, regret. "I don't know how to be the person you want me to be," Emily continued, her voice muffled. "I feel stupid, weak, like I'm always catching up to expectations I'll never reach." Jack closed his eyes. This was the part that undid him, the part that made everything feel unbearably complicated. "I never wanted perfection," he said quietly. "I wanted honesty." Silence followed, long loaded. Sandra entered the room sometime later, having heard enough to know what was happening. Her eyes moved between them, already glossy. "This is tearing us apart," she said, her voice trembling. "Jack, please, whatever decision you make, understand what it's doing to this family." Jack looked at her, and for the first time he saw how deeply this had cut her too. The mediator, the buffer, the one holding the pieces together while both sides pulled away. "I've questioned myself every step of the way," Jack said slowly. "What I did wrong, what I missed, what I enabled." He turned back to Emily. "And that's the truth I can't escape. I enabled you, I was helping, but I was protecting you from learning how to stand." Emily looked up, eyes red and searching. "So what now?" The question hung there, terrifying in its simplicity. Jack's chest tightened. Every instinct screamed to soften, to compromise, to take the pain away. But another voice, quieter, steadier, reminded him where that road led. "I'm not cutting you out of my life," he said, "but I'm done rescuing you." Emily's face crumpled again. "This doesn't mean I don't love you," Jack continued. "It means I love you enough to stop pretending this is working." Sandra covered her mouth, tears spilling freely now. "Healing is going to take time," Jack said, his voice breaking for the first time. "And it's going to hurt, but I cannot keep enabling behavior that's destroying you and all of us." Emily nodded weakly, devastation written across her face. As she left the house, the door closing softly behind her, Jack remained standing in the same spot, his heart pounding, his resolve shaking but intact. He knew this decision would echo for years. And as the silence settled in around him, Jack wondered, quietly, fearfully, whether this breaking point would finally lead to healing, or whether it had just broken them for good. The court date arrived without ceremony, printed plainly on official paper that felt heavier than it looked. Emily Harper versus the state, words Jack never imagined reading in connection with his daughter. Financial fraud, misrepresentation, reduced charges, Paul had explained, but charges nonetheless. Serious enough to leave a mark that wouldn't fade quickly. Jack didn't drive Emily to the courthouse. He told himself it was about boundaries, about letting her face what she'd done. But the truth was harder to admit. Standing beside her felt like an endorsement he wasn't sure he could give anymore. Sandra didn't see it that way. "She needs to know you haven't abandoned her," she said the night before, desperation edging into her voice. "Whatever mistakes she's made, she's still your daughter." Jack sat silently, staring at his hands. Guilt gnawed at him, not the kind that demanded action, but the kind that hollowed him out. He had drawn his line. Now he had to live with where it left everyone else. The morning of the hearing, Jack stood outside the courthouse longer than necessary, watching people pass through its doors with their own burdens, their own quiet catastrophes. When he finally went inside, he took a seat in the back row. Not hiding, just distant. Emily looked smaller than he remembered. Her shoulders were hunched, her eyes downcast. She didn't turn around at first. When she did and saw him there, something flickered across her face, surprise, relief, and shame all tangled together. Jack didn't wave, he didn't smile, he simply stayed. The proceedings were brief, efficient, and merciless in their clarity. Numbers were read aloud, transactions summarized, mistakes reduced to bullet points and legal language. Jack listened as strangers dissected his daughter's worst decisions without context or compassion. Every word felt like exposure. This was the cost, he reminded himself. Consequences were supposed to feel like this. Emily's attorney argued mitigation. Mental strain, poor judgment, not malicious intent. The judge listened without expression. Before the verdict, Emily was allowed to speak. Her voice shook as she stood. "I know I failed," she said, barely above a whisper. "I know I hurt people. I hurt my family." Her gaze drifted toward the back of the room, finding Jack. "I'm sorry," she said, and this time there was no performance left. "I'm trying to become someone better than the person who did this." Jack felt the words settle deep in his chest. He wanted to stand, to reach her, to say something, anything. But he stayed seated, hands clenched, heart racing. This wasn't his moment to interrupt. During a short recess, Emily approached him, eyes red, voice trembling. "Dad," she said quietly, "I don't expect anything. I need to know you don't hate me." Jack looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the weight she was carrying. The humiliation, the fear, the consequences he had once shielded her from now standing fully exposed. "I don't hate you," he said at last, "but forgiveness doesn't erase accountability." She nodded, tears spilling over. "I understand." When the judge returned, the room held its breath. The sentence was measured: probation, restitution, mandatory counseling, no prison time. Mild by legal standards. Devastating emotionally. Emily exhaled sharply, her knees nearly buckling. Sandra wept quietly beside Jack. Relief and grief tangled together in the aftermath, leaving no one untouched. As they filed out of the courtroom, Jack felt the weight of every stare, every unspoken judgment. This was public now. There was no reclaiming privacy, no pretending it hadn't happened. Outside, Emily stood alone, staring at the courthouse steps as if unsure whether to go. Up or down? Jack approached her slowly. "I'll walk with you," he said. She didn't respond immediately, but when she did, her hand brushed his arm, hesitant, uncertain. They walked side by side, not healed, not reconciled, but not completely broken either. Jack knew the sentence was only the beginning. The real consequences were still unfolding. Healing didn't arrive with relief or clarity. It arrived quietly, unevenly, in moments so small Jack almost missed them. There were no declarations, no sudden warmth, just an unspoken agreement that the worst had passed, and that surviving it would take patience neither of them was used to practicing. Jack and Emily began meeting once a week. Coffee shops at first, neutral places where leaving was easy if things grew tense. Their conversations stayed surface level, updates on work, therapy appointments, the weather. It felt fragile, like walking across ice that hadn't fully frozen. Still, Jack showed up, and so did she. At Sandra's urging, Jack started therapy himself. He resisted longer than he should have, convinced he'd already examined his failures enough. But sitting across from a stranger who didn't see him as a father or a villain changed something. He spoke about control, about silence, about how vulnerability had always felt like weakness. "You learn to protect yourself by withholding," the therapist said gently. "But protection can look like rejection to the people who love you." That truth stayed with him. Emily's progress was slower. Probation meetings, counseling sessions she didn't enjoy but attended anyway, entry-level work that bruised her pride. Some weeks she moved forward, other weeks she stalled. Jack noticed every fluctuation, his trust lagging behind her effort. He hated himself for it, but he didn't know how to turn that instinct off. Sandra remained the quiet bridge between them. She reminded Jack when his distance showed, reminded Emily when defensiveness crept back in. Some nights she was exhausted, emotionally spent from carrying a family, still learning how not to fracture again. "This isn't about forgetting," she told Jack once. "It's about allowing room for change." Forgiveness, Jack was learning, wasn't a single decision. It was a series of choices made daily, some harder than others. There were setbacks, moments when Emily's frustration flared and Jack's patience thinned. Words left unsaid outnumbered the ones spoken, but there were moments too, unexpected ones, that surprised him. One afternoon, Emily helped him carry groceries without being asked. Another time, she called just to check in, not to ask for anything. Once, while sitting in silence, she laughed at an old story he told, and the sound didn't hurt the way it once had. Jack began to appreciate those moments. He stored them carefully, like proof that effort mattered, even if trust hadn't fully caught up yet. The scars remained visible, in the way Jack flinched at excuses, in the way Emily watched his face closely, waiting for disappointment. Neither pretended otherwise. One evening, after dinner at Sandra's insistence, Jack and Emily stayed behind while the house settled into quiet. The tension was familiar, but softer now. "I know you still don't trust me," Emily said finally. Jack didn't deny it. Trust takes longer than regret. She nodded. "I'm not asking you to forget. I just don't want to be the worst thing I ever did." Jack considered that. "And I don't want to be the man who never let his daughter come back from her mistakes." The honesty between them felt fragile, but real. "I hurt you," Emily said, "and I know I can't undo that." Jack met her eyes. "I hurt you too, by staying distant when you needed to be seen." They sat with that truth, letting it exist without defense. When Emily left that night, Jack didn't feel relief. He felt something steadier. Acceptance maybe, or resolve. Healing wasn't finished. It might never be complete. But for the first time, Jack believed it was possible, not because the past had been erased, but because neither of them was running from it anymore. And that, he realized, might be enough to begin again. The moment didn't arrive with fanfare. No raised voices. No dramatic confession. It came quietly, the way real change often does, during a conversation Jack almost didn't take. Emily called on a Sunday afternoon. Her voice was steady, careful, stripped of the edge that had once defined it. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "And you can say no." Jack braced himself out of habit. "Go ahead." "I'm thinking about starting something small," she continued. "Nothing risky, just honest work. I don't need money. I just need to know if the idea makes sense." Jack felt the shift immediately, not in her words, but in what she wasn't asking for. They met later that week at his kitchen table. Emily laid out handwritten notes, rough timelines, modest projections. There was no grand vision, no inflated promises, just caution, restraint, responsibility. Jack listened, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel fear tightening in his chest. "I can help you think it through," he said, "but I won't fund it." Emily nodded without hesitation. "I wouldn't want you to." Something in Jack loosened then. A knot he'd carried for years finally gave way. He wasn't being tested. He wasn't being manipulated. She wasn't leaning on him, she was standing. They talked for over an hour. Jack offered guidance drawn from hard-earned experience, where to start, what to avoid, how to move slowly and protect herself from her own ambition. Emily took notes, asked questions, absorbed everything without defensiveness. Sandra watched from the doorway, quiet tears in her eyes. Later, she touched Jack's arm and whispered, "This is what we've been waiting for." Megan, ever practical, tempered the moment. "This is a good sign," she told Jack later. "But healing doesn't mean done, it means ongoing." Jack understood that now. What surprised him most was Emily's growth, but his own. The anger that had once burned so constantly felt distant, like a storm that had finally moved on. In its place was something softer, hope, cautious but real. He realized he wasn't bracing for disappointment anymore. He was allowing space for possibility. That night, Jack sat alone, reflecting on the walls he'd built. They had protected him when he didn't know how else to survive, but they had also kept him isolated. Watching Emily take responsibility for her life gave him permission to take responsibility for his own fear. He didn't need to be impenetrable to be strong. The next time he saw Emily, he hugged her. Brief, awkward, real. She froze for a second before returning it. It wasn't forgiveness in words. It was forgiveness in action. The family didn't suddenly become whole. There were still cautious conversations, unspoken worries, moments of doubt. But there was movement now forward together. For the first time since Christmas, Jack felt something shift beneath his feet. Not certainty, but solid ground. It was late afternoon when Emily stopped by, the house quiet in a way that felt peaceful instead of empty. Jack was in the kitchen, rinsing a mug when he sensed her behind him. She didn't announce herself. She didn't need to. I wanted to say thank you, she said softly. Jack turned, drying his hands on a towel. For what? For believing in me again, Emily replied, even when I didn't make it easy. The words landed gently without urgency or expectation. Jack studied her face and noticed what wasn't there anymore, the defensiveness, the hunger for approval. She looked steadier now, grounded. I didn't believe blindly, Jack said. I believed carefully. Emily smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. That evening, the family gathered for a small holiday dinner, not a replacement for what had been lost, but an acknowledgement of how far they'd come. The table wasn't extravagant, no forced cheer, just food, warmth, and conversation that didn't feel like walking through a minefield. Jack watched Emily move through the room, helping Sandra without being asked, laughing quietly with Megan. There was no performance in it, no need to be seen. She simply belonged. As the evening settled, Jack felt himself reflect on the journey that had brought them here, the humiliation, the anger, the nights filled with doubt. He thought about how close he'd come to letting bitterness define him, how easy it would have been to walk away convinced he was justified. But justification, he'd learned, wasn't the same as peace. Later, when the dishes were done and the house grew still again, Jack and Sandra sat together on the couch, their shoulders touching. It had been a long time since closeness felt effortless. We almost didn't make it, Sandra said quietly. Jack nodded. We didn't break, that counts for something. They talked about rebuilding, not just the family but their marriage, about how years of unspoken strain had piled up, hidden beneath responsibility and routine. They didn't resolve everything that night. They didn't need to. What mattered was the willingness to keep choosing each other. Emily left early, explaining she had an early morning. Jack watched her go, noticing how she carried herself differently now. Less weight, more intention. She was building something of her own, not just a business or a routine, but an identity that didn't depend on his approval or his resources. For the first time, Jack felt pride without fear trailing close behind it. Alone again, Jack stood at the window looking out at the quiet street. He understood now that love didn't mean endless sacrifice or silent endurance. It meant boundaries, trust, and the courage to let people grow, even when that growth involved failure. He made a decision then, quiet but final. He would stop living in reaction to the past, stop bracing for what might go wrong. The damage had been done, the lessons learned, carrying the weight of old wounds no longer served anyone. The family wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was honest now, and that honesty had given them something stronger than comfort. It had given them a future. As Jack turned off the lights and headed upstairs, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not relief, but readiness for whatever came next. The air was cold but clear as Jack and Emily walked side by side through the quiet park, their footsteps crunching softly against the gravel path. Winter hadn't fully loosened its grip yet, but the light had changed, brighter, more forgiving. They walked without hurry, hands tucked into their coats, letting silence exist without tension for the first time in a long while. Jack thought about how many walks they'd taken like this years ago, back when Emily was small and the world felt simpler, back when problems could be talked through without defenses rising like walls. Now, every step felt earned. I think about it a lot, Emily said finally, how close I came to losing everything, you myself. Jack nodded, so do I. They spoke about the past without circling it like an open wound. The Christmas dinner, the words that couldn't be taken back, the months of distance that followed. Naming it didn't reopen the pain, it gave it shape, made it something they could finally leave behind instead of carrying everywhere. I didn't understand what forgiveness really meant, Emily admitted. I thought it meant being let off the hook. Jack stopped walking for a moment, turning to face her. His voice was calm, steady. Forgiveness isn't easy, he said, but it's the only way to heal, not because it erases what happened, but because it lets you stop living inside it. Emily absorbed that quietly, nodding once. They resumed walking, the path opening toward the edge of the park where the trees thinned and the town came back into view. Life moving forward, indifferent to what they'd survived, and somehow that felt comforting. Later that evening, the family gathered again, not for an occasion but because they wanted to. No pressure, no agenda, just dinner, laughter that didn't feel forced, conversations that wandered naturally. Sandra smiled more easily now. Megan teased Jack about his habit of overthinking everything. Emily listened more than she spoke, present in a way that felt new. There was peace in it, not the absence of difficulty, but the absence of fear. Emily had built a routine of her own, work she was proud of, responsibilities she handled without asking for rescue. She spoke about the future carefully, realistically, with a determination Jack recognized as genuine. Watching her now, he felt something settle deep inside him. Closure. Not because everything had turned out perfectly, but because he no longer felt responsible for carrying her life on his shoulders. She was carrying it herself. Later, as Jack stood at the window, he watched Emily walk down the street toward her car, shoulders squared, steps confident. She didn't look back this time. She didn't need to. And that was how he knew they'd done it right. The family began to enjoy simple moments again. Morning coffee without tension. Casual phone calls without expectation. The kind of ordinary peace that only comes after surviving something that nearly breaks you. Jack understood now that forgiveness wasn't a single act. It was a legacy, passed down not through words but through choices, through boundaries held with love, through anger released instead of fed. As the night settled in and the house grew quiet, Jack felt gratitude, not for what had happened but for what it had taught him. Love didn't mean control. Strength didn't mean silence. And forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant walking forward together. Jack and Emily continued down their separate paths, side by side, their bond stronger than ever, a quiet testament to the power of forgiveness, growth, and love.